as the only member of my panel not fluent in Swedish, I had to rely on Google Translate. But I am very grateful to our host today for letting me come on my first trip to Sweden. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about the history of NATO expansion. It's a topic of my own personal interest. My interest in this grows out of a personal background. I was an exchange student studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989. And so everything that I've done afterwards has in some way been colored by that experience. I decided to become a historian to try to figure out the origins of what I saw on that day. And I have ended up writing a trilogy of books. I did not realize at the beginning that they would be a trilogy, and each book stands on its own, but they are related. I've written a book called The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall, and then another book about the foreign policy of German unification called 1989, The Struggle to Create Post-Cold War Europe. And as part of the research for that book, I came across early documents from the history of NATO expansion already in 1990. I published an article related to this, and it got so much attention that I decided to publish a book on the topic, which is called Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. And I was rather pleased to see when I walked in that the foundation had generously purchased 2 of these door stoppers, presumably as a cure for insomnia among conference participants. So it is highly effective. It is out there. If you can't sleep, you know what to do. So these books are based on historical research and interviews. I went and did research in France, Germany, Poland, Russia, the UK, and the US. This was all paid for by OPM, other people's money. That's the best way to get your research paid for. And I also did, for each book, close to 100 interviews. Some of them overlapped. So it's based on not only documents, many of which I got declassified, but also interviews, private papers, sound and video recordings. In particular, one of my biggest declassification breakthroughs was with the Clinton Library. I spent 3 years trying to get what I refer to as the Bill-Boris bromance in print. In other words, all of the transcripts, briefing books, after-action reports, and scuttlebutt from all of the Bill Clinton-Boris Yeltsin summits. There were 18 of them. Initially, my requests failed, so I had to go through a 3-year appeal process, and I was somewhat amazed when it eventually succeeded. If you're interested in this, I've put some of the more interesting excerpts on the line at the National Security Archive website. This is the starting page, so you can look that up if this is of interest to you. Among my many declassifications, which I've done in 6 countries, this one was unique because the Kremlin complained. This is a copy of the TASS news release, TASS being still the Russian news agency, following on the Soviet news agency. And when the Clinton Library declassified the records on the basis of my appeal, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said that was not right, that was not appropriate, because the documents on Yeltsin in particular from the late 1990s included quite a bit about Putin and how Putin became the heir to Yeltsin. Yeltsin discusses that quite openly, surprisingly openly with Clinton. From about late 97 on, he's looking for a successor. He's old, he's ill, he wants to exit, and he's auditioning a bunch of people. Above all, he really wanted Viktor Chernomyrdin. Interesting idea to think how different history would be today if he had succeeded in his plan of making Viktor Chernomyrdin his successor. But finally, he gets to Putin, and he tells Clinton, this is it, he's it, you've got to meet him, Putin's the guy. So the Peskov complained about this, said this should not have been released, and of course, that meant that I knew I'd really gotten the good stuff. And I was not disappointed. So the book, as you can see, is really a doorstopper. It's 600 pages. There's a lot more in it than I can talk about in the allotted 15 minutes. So I just want to focus on what I call the Scandinavian strategy, given where we are today. This is a map of Vladimir Putin's childhood, also my childhood. I realize it's a little hard to see the fine print in the back. The only thing you really want to pay attention to here is that this green color shows you what were Cold War NATO countries, and this orange color shows you what were Cold War Warsaw Pact countries. The Warsaw Pact was, of course, the involuntary alliance forced by the Soviet Union on Central and Eastern Europeans. And you can see here that the front line runs fairly far westward and indeed between the 2 halves of Germany. This is West Germany and East Germany. Again, I know it's a little hard to read the names in the back. So this is the Cold War line. Vladimir Putin, of course, is a loyal servant to the Soviet state. He grows up in Leningrad with stories of the heroism, Soviet heroism in World War II. He sees heroic movies about being a secret agent. He decides to join the KGB, or secret police, and he is actually positioned in East Germany, in Dresden, not all that far from where I actually was as an exchange student, although, of course, I didn't know him since I was inside West Berlin. But the important point is that he witnesses with his own eyes the collapse of this world order, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as many of you know, he has repeatedly described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, think about that for a minute. There is a lot of competition for that title. And his answer is collapse of the Soviet Union. He is also not happy about what follows. This is one of the maps from the book. This shows NATO as it was in 2020 with 30 countries. Again, I realize it's hard to see the tiny print, but basically anything that is white is a NATO country, and anything that is in this light gray color is not a NATO country. And so Vladimir Putin is very, very unhappy about this map. You can obviously see how much farther the line goes. And in particular, it is much closer to his hometown of St. Petersburg than when he was a young man. Now, what do I mean by Scandinavian strategy? Well, as NATO formed itself, Norway was one of the original members, but Norway was unique. It was the only original member to have a land border with the Soviet Union. And so Norway realized that its membership was qualitatively different than that of other countries. It realized, as I talk about in my book, Not 1 Inch, that the cost per inch of NATO enlargement goes up the closer you get to the border with the Soviet Union or to Russia. And so Norway did something that I think was very smart. I don't just say that because I know there are a lot of Norwegians in the room and one on the panel. But Norway decided to restrain itself. So it became a full member. It enjoys the full Article 5 guarantee. Article 5 is the heart of the NATO treaty. It's the article that states any member state will treat an attack on one as an attack on all. So it has the full Article 5 guarantee, but it's imposed conditions. So no foreign troops on its soil in peacetime, no nuclear weapons on its lands or in its ports. And the reason Norway did that voluntarily, that was not imposed on it by other allies, was to keep long-term frictions with the Soviet Union manageable. Norway realized that it lived in a neighborhood that was Soviet adjacent, but not Soviet controlled, and decided to take steps to both become a member and manage long-term frictions. And that is, I think, a very relevant example for today, because of course now we're talking about the Baltics, Finland, Sweden, all of which are now living in a neighborhood that is Russia adjacent, but not Russia controlled. And so this historical challenge, which was old, is now new again as we are talking about the future of this region. And here's a close-up in particular showing Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltics, in the context of Sweden and Finland. These are, of course, not yet NATO members. I do not think the Turkish objections will prevent Finland and Sweden from becoming members. I think it will happen. So I'm working on that assumption, and I'll talk about Finland. I'm talking about Finland and Sweden on the assumption they are going to be NATO members. Problem right now, of course, is this little part of Russia that is non-contiguous with the rest of the territory. And for this reason, I think it's very fortunate that Finland and Sweden want to join, because at the moment, this is a very big challenge for NATO to defend. These countries are already in NATO. They have the full Article 5 guarantee. But it is a real challenge to defend these countries as is. I have a map here. Now we're going to transition to why this could be issues in the future. This is a map, I have to admit, that I screenshotted from Twitter, so I can't vouch for the exact accuracy, but the rough image gives you an idea of what's going on. This is Russia, this orange color, and here you have the Baltics, and here you have Poland. And at present, you have to defend this without these regions being in NATO, and you have to defend this little corridor above all else. This is obviously very, very challenging. Once you have Sweden and Finland in, however, that makes this a much more masterable challenge. You have also the issue of what's called A2AD, anti-access area denial. I try to avoid jargon, but basically A2AD is the notion that you define a bubble and make it clear to your enemy that if you try to move within that bubble, it will be life-threatening, if not life-ending to you, generally by precision-guided munitions and missiles. So you see here in red, you see Russian A2AD bubbles, and you see one right here around Kaliningrad. And then you see the NATO A2 AD bubbles. And of course, you've got the big exception here, these gray zones of Finland and Sweden. Obviously, that would be one of the things to change right away around Gotland Island and so forth. So once you put Finland and Sweden into NATO, suddenly the Baltic starts to look much more like a NATO lake, especially you've got the islands of the passage of Denmark here. I think in light of the fact that there are pre-existing commitments to the Baltics, I think it is really in our interest that Finland and Sweden become members absolutely as soon as possible. Of course, there are going to be new risks. The border with NATO and Russia will more than double. You see this very subtle thing that I also screenshotted from Twitter, old border, new border. I think you can even see that in the back. But the point is you're now going to have this new territory, and you are going to have new questions that will arise about where to balance your priorities. Will they be maritime? Will they be land-based? The Baltics obviously have very high expectations about what Finland and Sweden coming in will be, what they will do for their defense. There will be internal issues. There already have been some. When I was researching my book on the 1990s, for example, I saw that there was a lot of quiet behind-the-scenes communications between the Swedes and the Finns with the Americans about the Baltics. And they went along the following lines. The Swedes and the Finns said to the Americans, you know, we live in a tricky neighborhood up here. And whatever we might feel, we all need to have business-like relations with the Russians. And the Baltics are really pushing hell for leather to get into NATO, and that might not be the best idea. It might not be in their own interest long term. Maybe we should talk to the Baltics. And when this is presented to Baltic leaders, they say, hell no, you guys think you understand Russia, right? Because you've lived up here. We really understand Russia. We're the captive nations. We were forced to be forced into the Soviet Union. We know how to deal with Moscow. We want Article 5 and all the bells and whistles yesterday. None of this nonsense about self-restraint or Norway-style conditions. And so there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and worry in Sweden and Finland back then. So it'll be interesting to see going forward whether discussions about a Scandinavian strategy, in other words, a self-restraint, whether that will be possible, whether Finland and Sweden will want that, what the Baltics will think about that. I don't know what the answer to this is. That is the province of people like General Major Wikman, who's going to be talking to us afterwards. We have the honor of the presence of a Swedish officer here. But I do want to signal that there are precedents in history for having thought about this issue, and there are precedents for having thought about this issue in this region. And so I think this is another case where it's important to look to history to help inform our decision-making about this time period. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Sure.
So what are the implications of the Baltic Sea becoming a NATO lake?
Well, are you asking me the question as a Russian or as a Swede or as an American? Cui bono.
As a guest at Engelsberg.
I think, obviously, as I said, given that obviously there are, on the one hand, you're picking up this huge new land border. So obviously that's a challenge. As I said, the NATO border with Russia will more than double. But given that there is the pre-existing Article 5 commitment to the Baltics, this is going to be very, very fortunate for that commitment. As you can see, in order to get into the Baltics, you have to navigate through here. And if this is all NATO territory, which it's going to be since Norway and Denmark are already in, that is very fortunate for NATO and very unfortunate for Moscow. That, however, has the knock-on consequence that you do need to think about Moscow's reactions, right? So this is why I thought that was a wise strategy in 1949 on the part of Norway to think about the political responses, since obviously we've seen the man in the Kremlin will lash out even in ways that are self-harming. So as this happens, it's important to keep that in mind. That is, by the way, what is dangerous about the Turkish demands now. I don't think Turkey, as I said, will stop Finland and Sweden from becoming members of NATO, but they are extending this interim period, which is tricky and dangerous and can give Russia time to think about ways to respond in that area.
But Finland has for a long time been able to defend its own border without the help of NATO. Is the change greater for Sweden, its new role as a NATO member, if it happens?
Well, Finland obviously is thinking about adding a nuclear component, and as you heard from Charlie's wise comments, that's something that it wants to outsource, right? It wants to be a part of NATO's nuclear umbrella, not a nuclear power in its own right. So I think, I wouldn't say that Finland is sort of sorted and, baked. So I think there's going to be a lot of changes in Finland as well. So I would say that there's challenges of different kinds for both countries would be my answer.
This far, thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much.